When you think of the deadliest civil war in human history, your mind probably jumps straight to the American Civil War. Roughly 620,000 soldiers died, tearing a young nation in two. Or maybe you think of World War I, where modern industrial warfare slaughtered 20 million people across Europe. But what if I told you that in the middle of the 19th century, a single conflict erupted that killed up to 30 million people? That is more than the entire population of Australia today, completely wiped off the face of the earth. And the wildest part? It was not started by a ruthless dictator, a clash of superpower empires, or a fight over gold. It was started by a young farm boy who failed a job interview, had a severe fever dream, and convinced himself he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This is the story of the Taiping Rebellion, a war so bloody, so bizarre, and so destructive that it nearly erased one of the oldest empires on Earth from existence. So how on earth does a failed test taker start a religious cult that slaughters 30 million people? To understand that, we have to rewind all the way back to China in the 1830s. In the early 1800s, China was ruled by the Qing Dynasty. On paper, it was a massive, wealthy superpower spanning millions of square miles. But under the surface, the whole country was quietly rotting away. For starters, the rulers of the Qing Dynasty were not actually ethnic Han Chinese, who made up over 90% of the population. They were Manchus, invaders from the north, who had conquered China 200 years earlier. The Manchus kept all the top military and political jobs for themselves, forced Han men to wear the Q hairstyle as a sign of submission, and treated the locals like second-class citizens. On top of that, the British Empire had just flooded China with opium, turning millions of people into addicts and winning a humiliating war that forced China to pay massive debts. Taxes were skyrocketing, corruption was everywhere, and millions of starving peasants were looking for anyone to blame. Enter a young man named Xiuquan. Hong was born in a small village in southern China. He was a smart kid, the pride of his family, and everyone in his town knew he was destined for greatness. You see, back then, the only way to escape poverty and get a comfortable government job was to pass the civil service exams. These were notoriously brutal tests on ancient Confucian philosophy. If you passed, you became a wealthy government official. If you failed, you went right back to shoveling mud on the farm. So, in 1836, Hong packed his bags and traveled to the big city of Guangzhou to take the exam. He failed. No big deal, right? He went home, studied harder, and tried again. Failed again. He tried a third time in 1843. Failed again. Imagine dedicating your entire youth to a single test, failing 3 times in a row, and realizing you have disgraced your entire family. The stress completely broke him. Hong had a massive nervous breakdown and collapsed into a high fever that lasted for weeks. While lying in bed, hovering between life and death, Hong had a series of vivid, terrifying dreams. In these dreams, an old man with a long golden beard handed Hong a glowing sword and told him that the world was full of evil demons. Sitting next to the old man was a middle-aged figure who called Hong his brother. The old man commanded Hong to purify the world and slay the demons that were destroying humanity. When Hong finally woke up, his family noticed he was a completely different person. He was taller, he spoke with absolute authority, and he kept talking about demons. But nobody really knew what any of it meant. So Hong put the dream behind him, picked up his books, and tried to pass the civil service exam one last time. He failed a 4th time, and that was the final straw. Disgusted with the government and feeling completely worthless, Hong happened to reread a small Christian pamphlet he had picked up years earlier from a Western missionary on the street. As he flipped through the pages, a light bulb went off in his head. The old man with the golden beard in his fever dream? That was God the Father. The middle-aged man calling him brother? That was Jesus Christ, which meant Hong Xiuquan was not just some guy who failed a job test. He was the literal younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent down to earth by God to cleanse China of demons. And who were the demons? You guessed it, the ruling Manchu Qing Dynasty. You cannot make this stuff up. Most people in his situation would have been locked away or laughed out of town. But Hong did not just keep this revelation to himself. He went out into the countryside and started preaching. He traveled south to Guangxi province, a poor, lawless region, full of desperate peasants, bandits, and an ethnic minority group called the Hakkas, who were constantly being bullied by local landowners. To these starving, oppressed people, Hong's message sounded like the best news they had ever heard. He did not just preach about heaven, he promised complete social equality. Land would be divided equally among everyone. Private property was abolished. Slavery and foot-binding were banned. Women were declared equal to men and allowed to hold office and fight in the military. And most importantly, he promised that if they overthrew the evil Manchu demons, God would create a paradise on earth. Hey, are you tired of starving while foreign Manchus take your money? Yeah, it is terrible. What if I told you I am Jesus' younger brother and God gave me a sword to fix everything? Wait, Jesus has a brother? He sure does, and he is standing right in front of you. Well, I am sold. Where do I sign up? Hong called his group the God-Worshipping Society, and within a few short years, what started as a handful of followers ballooned into over 20,000 radicalized converts. They smashed Buddhist and Taoist statues, burned local ancestral temples, and pooled all their money into a shared communal treasure. Unsurprisingly, local Qing officials started getting very nervous. They sent local troops to disperse the cult. Big mistake. The God worshippers did not run. They fought back, routed the government soldiers, and seized their weapons. On January 11, 1851, his 38th birthday, Hong Xiuquan officially declared open rebellion against the Qing Empire. He proclaimed the establishment of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, naming himself the Heavenly King. The ironical part? Taiping literally translates to Great Peace. And Great Peace was about to unleash the most apocalyptic slaughter Asia had ever seen. The Taiping army started marching north out of Guangxi, and like a rolling snowball, they picked up tens of thousands of new recruits at every single village. Starving peasants, coal miners, river pirates, and entire families joined the march. Within months, Hong's army grew from 20,000 to over 500,000 soldiers. And this was not just a regular army, it was a fanatical, hyper-disciplined religious machine. Hong enforced strict puritanical rules. Alcohol, tobacco, opium, gambling, and prostitution were strictly forbidden under penalty of death. Men and women were separated into completely different military units. Even married couples were executed if they were caught having intimate relations. Every soldier woke up, prayed to God, memorized Hong's religious texts, and marched into battle believing that if they died, they were going straight to paradise. Standing in their way were the Qing imperial forces, but the Qing army was a complete joke. The soldiers were corrupt, poorly trained, and half of them were addicted to opium. When the fanatical Taiping army charged at them screaming hymns and brandishing swords, the imperial troops threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. In March 1853, just 2 years after declaring his rebellion, Hong's army arrived at the gates of Nanking, one of the largest, richest, and most important cities in China. After a 2-week siege, Taiping engineers blew up a section of the city walls with gunpowder. Hundreds of thousands of Taiping soldiers poured through the breach. What followed was pure horror. Hong had declared that all Manchus were demons, and demons could not be allowed to live. Over the next few days, Taiping forces systematically slaughtered nearly every single Manchu man, woman, and child in the city. Over 30,000 people were butchered in the streets. Hong captured Nanking, renamed it Tianjin, meaning the heavenly capital, and declared it the center of his new divine empire. A guy who failed his civil service exam 10 years earlier was now running a breakaway state with millions of subjects, controlling the wealthiest heartland of China. And this is where things went from crazy to completely unhinged. Now that Hong Xiuquan had his heavenly capital, you would think he would get down to the boring work of running a government, right? Nope. The moment Hong moved into his lavish new palace in Nanking, he basically retired from public life. He handed over day-to-day operations to his generals, locked himself inside his grand estate, and spent his time lounging around with hundreds of concubines. Remember how intimacy was strictly banned for all regular Taiping followers on pain of death? Well, turns out those rules did not apply to Jesus' younger brother. While Hong was living like a king, his top generals were running a totalitarian nightmare outside the palace walls. Private property was completely banned. Everyone was organized into military brigades. All food and clothing were handed out by government stores. If you were caught smoking tobacco, you were beaten. If you were caught smoking opium, you were executed. And under the surface, a bitter power struggle was brewing among the Taiping leadership. Because Hong was not the only one claiming to speak for God. His top military commander, a former charcoal seller named Yang Xiuqan, was a tactical genius. But he also claimed that he could go into trances where God the Father possessed his body. So, whenever Yang wanted to boss someone around, he would fall to the floor, pretend God was speaking through him, and issue orders. Hong smiled, played along, and quietly waited for his chance to strike. In 1856, Yang went too far. He used his God trance to demand that Hong grant him the same supreme title as Hong himself. Hong had finally had enough. He secretly summoned his other top generals to Tianjin. In the middle of the night, they surrounded Yang's palace, dragged him out, and executed him alongside his entire family. Then, over the next 3 months, Hong's men went on a paranoid killing spree across the city, executing over 20,000 of Yang's followers and officers. And when the general who led the purge started looking a little too powerful, Hong had him assassinated too. By the time the blood dried, the Taiping movement had lost its best military minds, its brightest leaders, and its unity. The Heavenly Kingdom was rotting from the inside out, and outside the city walls, the Qing Empire was finally getting its act together. Terrified that the Taiping rebels were going to wipe out their empire, the Qing Emperor turned to a brilliant Han scholar named Zeng Guofan. Zeng realized that the official Qing army was useless, so he went back to his home province and built a brand new, highly disciplined local militia called the Xiang army. Zeng's strategy was simple, brutal, and relentlessly methodical. He did not rush into big open battles. He marched his army down the Yangtze River, besieging one Taiping city at a time. When Zeng took a city, he did not just liberate it. He burned farms, destroyed crops, and slaughtered anyone suspected of supporting the rebels. Meanwhile, the Taiping leaders made a massive diplomatic blunder. They thought that because they called themselves Christians, foreign powers like Britain and France would naturally join their side against the Confucian Qing Dynasty. At first, Western diplomats were curious. They sent envoys to Nanking to meet the rebels. "Sir, we have arrived in the rebel capital. They claim to be Christians." "Wonderful. Perhaps we can trade with them and form an alliance." There is a slight issue, sir." "What issue?" "Their leader says he is Jesus Christ's younger brother. He rewrote the Bible, and he is demanding we bow down to him as the king of the world." "Right. Let us stick with the Qing." The Western powers quickly realized that Xiuquan was completely unstable. Plus, the British and French had just forced the Qing government to sign new trade treaties that made them millions of dollars selling opium and goods. The Taiping rebels banned opium and threatened to ruin European trade. So Britain and France picked their side. They lent modern artillery, steamships, and officers to the Qing Dynasty. A famous foreign mercenary unit, led first by an American-looking figure and later by a British-looking figure, became known as the Ever-Victorious Army. Armed with European rifles and artillery, combined with Zeng Guofan's massive homegrown army, the trap began to tighten around the Heavenly Kingdom. By 1862, Zeng Guofan's forces had completely surrounded Nanking. For 2 long years, the city was locked in a brutal, soul-crushing siege. Inside the walls, food ran out completely. People ate horses, dogs, rats, and eventually wild grass and weeds. Famine swept through the city, followed by horrific outbreaks of disease. Thousands died in the streets every single day. When his generals begged Xiuquan to let the citizens surrender or evacuate, Hong refused. He claimed that God would send manna from heaven to feed his people. To prove it, Hong went into his garden, picked a handful of weeds, ate them, and ordered his citizens to do the same. Unsurprisingly, eating random weeds made Hong severely ill. On June 1st, 1864, as Qing artillery battered the city walls, Hong Xiuquan died inside his palace at the age of 50. Some say he poisoned himself. Others say he succumbed to disease and starvation. His 14-year-old son was put on the throne, but there was nothing left to save. 6 weeks later, on July 19, 1864, Qing troops detonated massive explosives under the city walls and stormed into Nanking. What followed was 3 days of absolute carnage. Qing soldiers were given total freedom to slaughter, loot, and burn. Over 100,000 people were butchered inside Nanking in less than a week. Rather than be captured, thousands of Taiping followers set fire to their own homes and burned themselves alive. Hong's body was dug up, wrapped in a sheet, and burned. To ensure he could never be buried, Qing commanders loaded his ashes into a cannon and fired them out into the sky. The heavenly kingdom of great peace was dead. When the smoke finally cleared in 1864, the sheer scale of the destruction left the world stunned. 14 years of non-stop warfare had laid waste to 16 provinces. Entire cities were reduced to ash. Farm fields reverted to wilderness. Famine and plague, sparked by the destruction of crops, ended up killing far more people than the actual battles. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30 million people died during the Taiping Rebellion. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 5% of the entire population of the globe at the time. It remains the deadliest civil war in human history and the second bloodiest conflict ever fought, behind only World War II. The Qing Dynasty technically won the war, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. To survive, the imperial court had been forced to give massive power to local Han generals and regional warlords, shattering central imperial authority. The financial cost broke the country's economy, and foreign powers now held complete control over China's trade. Less than 50 years later, in 1911, the Qing Dynasty collapsed for good, ending thousands of years of imperial rule in China. All because a young man failed a test, caught a fever, and convinced himself he was the brother of Jesus Christ. History is full of crazy stories, but the Taiping Rebellion might just take the crown for the most destructive fever dream of all time. If you learned something new today, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild history stories. And if you think a war started by Jesus' brother is insane, wait until you hear about the time Latin America almost became a single unified superpower, only for two heroes to ruin everything in a single room. Click here to watch that video next, and I will catch you next time.